The story of Leif Erikson cannot be fully understood without first examining the historical and cultural backdrop that shaped his life. Born into the Viking Age, Leif was a product of a seafaring and warrior society that valued exploration, conquest, and resilience in the face of adversity. The Vikings, originating from Scandinavia, were renowned for their daring voyages across the North Atlantic, their military prowess, and their complex social structures. From the late 8th to the early 11th century, they played a crucial role in shaping European history, expanding their influence through both trade and warfare. Viking society was structured around a combination of familial bonds, political alliances, and a deeply ingrained sense of adventure. The Norse were skilled navigators, relying on their knowledge of the stars, ocean currents, and seasonal winds to traverse vast distances. Their ships, particularly the longships, were technological marvels of the time, designed for both speed and versatility. This mastery of maritime travel allowed them to reach distant lands, including the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and ultimately North America. It was within this adventurous spirit that Leif Erikson was raised, inheriting the boldness of his forebears. Leif's family played a pivotal role in the Viking expansion across the Atlantic. His grandfather, Thorvald Asvaldsson, was exiled from Norway due to a crime, a fate that befell many Norsemen of the time. Seeking refuge, he and his family relocated to Iceland, which had become a hub for Viking settlers. However, exile seemed to be a recurring theme in the Erikson lineage, as Thorvald's son, Eric the Red, also found himself banished from Iceland after being accused of murder. This forced him to explore and settle in Greenland, an act that would later lay the foundation for Leif's own expeditions. Eric the Red's colonization of Greenland in the late 10th century was one of the most ambitious Norse ventures of the era. He established two main settlements, the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq and the western settlement near Nuuk. These colonies, though isolated and harsh, managed to thrive for centuries, thanks to the settlers' resilience and adaptation to their environment. Growing up in such an unforgiving landscape, Leif Erikson was exposed to the importance of resourcefulness and survival skills from an early age, qualities that would later serve him well on his own voyages. In addition to their skills as sailors and warriors, the Vikings were also adept traders and farmers. While much of their reputation in medieval chronicles is tied to their raids on European monasteries and villages, they were equally engaged in peaceful trade across the known world. Viking merchants traveled as far as Constantinople and the Middle East, exchanging goods such as furs, walrus ivory, and amber for silver, silk, and spices. This extensive trade network helped shape the economic and political landscape of the medieval North Atlantic and provided the resources necessary for ambitious expeditions like those of Eric the Red and Leif Erikson. Religion also played a significant role in Norse society, particularly during Leif Erikson's lifetime. The Vikings traditionally followed a polytheistic belief system centered on gods such as Odin, Thor, and Freya. Their mythology was rich with tales of exploration, fate, and honor, reinforcing the values that guided Norse warriors and explorers. However, by the late 10th century, Christianity was beginning to take root in Scandinavian society. Many Norse rulers, including Norway's King Olaf Tryggvason, were converting to Christianity and actively encouraging their subjects to do the same. This religious shift would later influence Leif Erikson's own journey when he traveled to Norway and encountered King Olaf. The Viking expansion was not merely a product of their adventurous spirit, but was also driven by necessity. Overpopulation and limited arable land in Scandinavia forced many Norsemen to seek new territories where they could settle and thrive. This need for new land led to the colonization of Iceland in the 9th century and Greenland in the late 10th century. It was only a matter of time before the next generation of Norse explorers, including Leif Erikson, would push even further into uncharted territories. By the time Leif was born around 970 to 980 CE, the Viking Age was at its peak. The Norse had established settlements across the North Atlantic, and their influence was expanding into the European mainland, the British Isles, and even parts of Russia. This period was characterized by a blending of cultures, as Viking warriors, traders, and settlers interacted with other civilizations. As the son of Eric the Red, Leif grew up in this world of exploration and conquest, making it almost inevitable that he would embark on his own journey of discovery. Leif Erikson's heritage was, therefore, deeply intertwined with the Viking spirit of adventure and resilience. His ancestors had been exiled, had conquered new lands, and had thrived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. This legacy of perseverance and exploration was ingrained in Leif from childhood, providing him with the skills and mindset necessary to become one of history's most renowned explorers. His journey to Vinland would be the culmination of generations of Norse exploration and ambition. Leif Erikson was born into a world of unrelenting hardship and opportunity, where survival depended on skill, courage, and adaptability. His early years were spent in Greenland, a land of stark beauty and unforgiving landscapes, shaped by icy fjords, towering cliffs, and long, dark winters. Unlike the lush and fertile lands that Viking settlers had known in Scandinavia, Greenland was a place where only the most resilient could thrive. It was here that Leif was raised, learning the lessons of endurance that would later define his legacy as an explorer. Growing up in Greenland, Leif was exposed to the daily struggles of Norse settlers, who relied on hunting, fishing, and limited farming to sustain their small communities. The land, though harsh, offered enough resources for those who knew how to use them wisely. Sheep and cattle provided milk, wool, and meat, while the surrounding seas teemed with fish and seals. From a young age, Leif would have been taught the skills necessary to live off the land, developing an intimate knowledge of the environment that would later aid him in his own expeditions. Despite its isolation, Greenland was not devoid of human connection. The settlements established by Leif's father, Eric the Red, maintained strong ties with Iceland and Norway, trading goods such as walrus ivory, furs, and hides in exchange for essential supplies like iron tools and grain. Ships arrived sporadically, bringing news of distant lands and the ever-changing world beyond the North Atlantic. These interactions exposed Leif to tales of faraway places, igniting within him a curiosity that would eventually lead him across the ocean. The long winters in Greenland were particularly harsh, forcing families to spend months indoors, where storytelling became an essential part of life. In the dimly lit halls of their sod and timber homes, Leif would have listened to sagas of gods and warriors, of legendary voyages and heroic deeds. These tales, passed down from generation to generation, instilled in him a deep respect for his ancestors and their daring exploits. The stories of great explorers like his own father, who had ventured into the unknown and carved out a new home in the wilderness, would have been especially influential. As the son of Eric the Red, Leif was expected to grow into a capable leader. His education was not limited to survival skills. He was also taught the customs and traditions of his people. He learned the laws of the Norse, the importance of honor and loyalty, and the art of negotiation, traits that would later define his leadership. He trained in combat, mastering the use of swords, axes, and shields. For in the Viking world, even explorers needed to be warriors. Strength alone, however, was not enough. Intelligence and strategy were just as important. From an early age, Leif was also introduced to the art of navigation, a skill that would become vital in his later voyages. The Norse had no compasses, relying instead on their deep understanding of the sun, stars, and ocean currents. Experienced sailors taught him how to read the shifting patterns of the waves, recognize subtle changes in the wind, and use the flight of seabirds as indicators of nearby land. These lessons were not learned in books, but through experience, on the decks of longships that cut through the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. Leif's family life was shaped by his father's imposing presence. Eric the Red was known for his fiery temper and unyielding will, qualities that had led him to both exile and success. Though a harsh man, he was also a visionary, seeing potential where others saw only desolation. Leif, though more measured in temperament, inherited his father's boldness and ambition. However, he also developed a keen sense of diplomacy, a skill that would set him apart from his father and aid him in his dealings with foreign rulers and indigenous peoples alike. His mother, Fjodhild, played a quieter yet equally important role in his upbringing. Unlike Erik, who remained loyal to the Old Norse gods, Fjodhild embraced Christianity, a growing influence among the Norse people. She built the first church in Greenland, marking the beginning of the region's religious transformation. Though Leif was raised in a pagan society, his mother's faith would later influence his decisions and shape his legacy as both an explorer and a missionary. As Leif reached adulthood, it became clear that he would not be content to remain in Greenland forever. The isolation of the settlements, the stories of distant lands, and his natural curiosity all pushed him toward a greater destiny. Unlike his father, who had been forced into exile, Leif had the freedom to choose his own path. The sea called to him, and he was eager to see what lay beyond the horizon. As Leif Erikson grew into adulthood, his restless spirit and thirst for adventure drove him beyond the isolated shores of Greenland. The stories of distant lands, bustling trade centers, and powerful rulers had filled his imagination since childhood. But Greenland, despite its harsh beauty, was not the center of the Norse world. It was a remote outpost, a frontier where survival overshadowed ambition. If Leif was to become more than just a chieftain's son, he needed to step into the wider stage of Viking society. That opportunity came when he set sail for Norway, the heart of the Norse realm. Leif's journey to Norway was not merely one of exploration, but one of purpose. As the son of Erik the Red, he carried the weight of his family's name and reputation. Greenland settlements depended on trade with the Norse kingdoms for essential goods: iron, timber, grains, and other resources that could not be found in the Arctic landscape. These trading voyages were vital to the survival of the Greenlanders, and they required skilled navigators and negotiators. For Leif, however, the trip to Norway was more than a mission of commerce. It was a chance to prove himself in the world beyond Greenland. The voyage across the North Atlantic was treacherous, but Leif was well prepared. His years of training in navigation and seafaring had made him adept at reading the winds and the stars. The longship he commanded was built for both speed and endurance, its sleek hull designed to cut through the waves with ease. As the journey progressed, he and his crew encountered storms that tested their seamanship, with towering waves threatening to capsize their vessel. Yet Leif's steady leadership kept them on course, and after weeks at sea, they finally reached the shores of Norway. Arriving in Norway was unlike anything Leif had ever experienced. The settlements in Greenland were small and isolated, but here, in the heart of the Viking world, the power and grandeur of the Norse kingdoms were on full display. Towering wooden halls stood proudly. Bustling marketplaces overflowed with merchants, and warriors clad in fine armor walked the streets. It was a land of kings and jarls, where wealth and influence were measured not just by strength, but by alliances and loyalty. It was here that Leif would encounter one of the most formidable figures of his time, King Olaf Tryggvason. King Olaf was a man of great ambition, a ruler determined to spread Christianity across the Norse lands. A fierce warrior and a devout Christian, he had spent years consolidating power, converting Viking chieftains, and waging wars against those who resisted the new faith. When Leif Erikson arrived at his court, he was welcomed not just as a traveler, but as the son of the legendary Erik the Red. Though Erik himself had remained a staunch follower of the old gods, his son was a different man, one who was open to new ideas and the winds of change sweeping across the Norse world. Leif spent months in King Olaf's court, absorbing the customs, politics, and beliefs of Norway's elite. He observed the growing influence of Christianity, a faith that was rapidly replacing the traditional Norse religion. Olaf, seeing potential in the young explorer, took a personal interest in him. The king spoke to Leif of Christ, of the salvation his faith offered, and of his vision for a unified Norse world under the cross. Though Leif had been raised in a household where pagan traditions still held sway, He could not ignore the power and conviction of Olaf's words. It was during this time that Leif converted to Christianity. Whether out of genuine belief or a pragmatic understanding of the changing tides, he embraced the new faith and was baptized. This decision marked a turning point in his life. King Olaf saw him as a useful ally in spreading Christianity to Greenland, and before Leif departed, the king entrusted him with a mission to return to Greenland and bring the new faith to its people. It was an assignment that would place him at odds with his father, but one that he accepted nonetheless. Beyond religious matters, Leif's time in Norway expanded his understanding of leadership and diplomacy. He learned the ways of the royal court, the importance of forging alliances, and the necessity of balancing power with wisdom. Olaf's rule was not just built on military strength, but on strategy and influence. Leif took these lessons to heart, recognizing that true leadership required more than just bravery in battle. It demanded foresight, patience, and the ability to unite people under a common cause. As his time in Norway came to an end, Leif prepared for his return journey, but fate had other plans. A series of events would soon lead him off course, setting him on a path that neither he nor King Olaf could have foreseen. The journey back to Greenland would prove to be far more than a simple voyage. It would be the moment that cemented his place in history. With new convictions and an expanded sense of purpose, Leif Erikson boarded his ship and set sail westward. Yet as the waves carried him toward home, they also carried him toward an unexpected discovery, one that would make him the first European to set foot on the shores of North America. As Leif Erikson set sail from Norway, the cold wind filled his ship's sail, propelling him toward the distant shores of Greenland. He carried with him not only supplies and goods from the Norse heartland, but also new convictions and a sense of purpose instilled by King Olaf. His mission was clear: to return to his homeland and spread the message of Christianity. Yet, the sea had other plans, and fate would soon lead him far beyond the familiar waters of the North Atlantic. The voyage began as expected, with clear skies and favorable winds guiding Leif's ship westward. His longship, a sturdy vessel built for both speed and endurance, cut through the waves effortlessly. The men aboard were seasoned sailors, accustomed to the dangers of the open ocean. They relied on their knowledge of the stars and the movement of birds to navigate, but in the unpredictable northern seas, no amount of skill could fully protect them from nature's wrath. Days into the journey, the weather took a sudden and violent turn. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, swallowing the sun in an ominous gray haze. The wind howled like an angry spirit, and the once gentle waves rose into towering walls of water that crashed against the ship with unrelenting force. The crew scrambled to secure the sails and reinforce the ship's structure, but the storm showed no mercy. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the terrified faces of the sailors as rain lashed against their skin. Leif gripped the tiller with all his strength, his knuckles white as he fought to keep the ship from capsizing. Each passing wave threatened to pull them under, but his steady leadership and deep understanding of the sea kept them afloat. Hours stretched into what felt like an eternity, and exhaustion seeped into the bones of the crew. Finally, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm began to wane, the wind slowing, the sea settling. But when the clouds cleared and the sun peeked through the mist, Leif and his men found themselves adrift in unfamiliar waters. In the distance, a dark outline of land emerged through the morning haze. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, lush, green, and abundant. The shore stretched far, dotted with thick forests and rolling hills. The air was different here, fresher and warmer than the harsh winds of Greenland. Bewildered but intrigued, Leif ordered his men to steer toward the land, eager to explore this unknown place that had revealed itself to them by chance. As they approached the coast, the sight of towering trees astonished the crew. Greenland was a land of ice and rock, where timber was a scarce and valuable resource. Yet here, an endless supply of wood stretched before them. The ground was soft, covered in thick grass and fertile soil, a stark contrast to the rugged terrain they had known all their lives. Rivers snaked through the landscape, their clear waters teeming with fish. The land was untouched, pristine, and inviting. Leif and his men made their way inland, carefully observing their surroundings. They found wild grapes growing in abundance, their deep purple fruit unlike anything they had seen before. So remarkable was this discovery that Leif named the land Vinland, meaning wineland in Old Norse. The very existence of such a fertile and resource-rich land seemed almost mythical, as though they had stumbled upon a hidden paradise beyond the known world. The men explored further, discovering that the forests were full of game, the rivers abundant with salmon, and the climate far more temperate than Greenland. They built temporary shelters, spending days marveling at the bounty of the land. Some believed they had found a new home, a place where Norse settlements could thrive without the hardships of Greenland's bitter winters. But Leif, ever the cautious leader, knew they had to tread carefully. They were strangers in an unknown land, and though it appeared uninhabited, there was no telling what lay beyond the dense forests. As much as the men wished to stay, Leif made the difficult decision to return to Greenland. He knew his father, Eric the Red, was waiting for him, and he had a duty to fulfill. He ordered his crew to gather supplies, wood, grapes, and other valuable resources to bring back home. Before leaving, he took note of the coastline, marking the landmarks in his mind, ensuring that he could one day find his way back. Vinland, he knew, was too valuable to be forgotten. With sails raised once more, Leif and his men departed the shores of Vinland, the taste of adventure still fresh on their lips. The land they had stumbled upon was no mere rumor or sailor's tale. It was real, waiting to be explored further. The voyage back to Greenland was marked by anticipation and reflection. The men aboard Leif Erikson's ship spoke excitedly of Vinland, recounting its fertile lands, abundant rivers, and vast forests. They had seen a place unlike any they had ever known, and the idea of settling there lingered in their minds. Yet, as the coastline of Greenland came into view, reality returned. Their homeland was a world of ice, rock, and struggle, and the people who awaited them knew nothing of the paradise that lay across the sea. When Leif and his crew finally set foot on Greenland's shores, they were met with curiosity and relief. Their voyage had taken longer than expected, and many had feared the worst. But the news they brought astonished their kin. Tales of a rich and fertile land beyond the Western Ocean, where food and timber were plentiful. Some doubted their words, skeptical that such a place could exist. Others, particularly those weary of Greenland's harsh conditions, listened with wide eyes, eager to believe in the possibility of a new future. Among those awaiting Leif's return was his father, Eric the Red. The aging chieftain, though proud of his son's journey, remained deeply skeptical of the newfound land. Eric was a man of Greenland, a pioneer who had built his legacy upon its shores. He had fought for his place in this harsh world, carving out a home where others had seen only desolation. To him, the idea of abandoning it for an unproven land was foolish. Greenland is our home, he reminded Leif, and it has given us life when nothing else would. Yet Leif saw the world differently. He had stood upon the shores of Vinland, tasted its sweet grapes, and breathed its warm air. He knew Greenland's struggles all too well. The thin soil, the scarcity of wood, the constant fight for survival. In Vinland, those struggles could be eased. But convincing the people of Greenland to embrace the unknown was no easy task. The Norse were adventurers, but they were also deeply rooted in their traditions and wary of abandoning what they had fought to build. As Leif settled back into life in Greenland, he did not forget his other mission, the one given to him by King Olaf Tryggvason. He had promised to bring Christianity to Greenland, and though his father remained a steadfast follower of the old gods, many in the settlement were open to change. His mother, Jodhild, was among the first to accept the new faith, encouraging others to follow. With her support, Leif helped establish Greenland's first Christian church, a small wooden chapel that stood as a symbol of the island's growing transformation. But not all welcomed the change. Many of Greenland's settlers remained devoted to the gods of their ancestors, unwilling to forsake the beliefs that had guided them for generations. Tensions arose between the old ways and the new, and Leif found himself caught between two worlds. As a leader, he did not force conversion upon his people, but he did not abandon his mission either. He spoke of Christianity with conviction, hoping that, over time, more would come to accept it willingly. Meanwhile, the stories of Vinland spread throughout Greenland, reaching the ears of ambitious men who saw opportunity in its discovery. Some, inspired by Leif's voyage, began preparing expeditions of their own. Among them was Leif's own brother, Thorvald, who longed to see this distant land for himself. Leif, though preoccupied with his duties in Greenland, offered his brother guidance, warning him of the unknown dangers that might lurk beyond Vinland's shores. Though Leif remained in Greenland, his heart was divided. He had seen a land that could change the fate of his people, yet he was bound by responsibility to his homeland. His leadership was needed here, where Greenland's future was still uncertain. The introduction of Christianity, the growing interest in Vinland, and the challenges of survival all required his attention. And so, he stayed, watching as others took up the journey he had begun. In time, expeditions to Vinland would continue, though none would establish a permanent settlement. Some would encounter native peoples, others would suffer misfortune, and eventually, the Norse presence in North America would fade into history. But Leif's legacy endured. He had proven that land lay beyond the Western Ocean, long before any other European explorer. As the seasons passed in Greenland, Leif Erikson became known not just as a traveler, but as a leader, a bridge between the old ways and the new. As Leif Erikson settled into his leadership role in Greenland, his thoughts often drifted back to Vinland. Though duty had kept him from returning, the stories of his discovery had ignited a fire in the hearts of many. Among those who longed to set foot on Vinland's shores was his own brother, Thorvald Eriksson. Unlike Leif, who had approached exploration with caution and diplomacy, Thorvald was a warrior at heart, eager for conquest and glory. To him, Vinland was not just a place of resources and opportunity, it was a land to be claimed. With Leif's guidance, Thorvald prepared a voyage westward, determined to explore Vinland further and establish a more lasting presence. He gathered a crew of skilled men, seasoned sailors and fighters who would follow him into the unknown. Unlike Leif's journey, which had been shaped by fate and accident, Thorvald's was one of deliberate intent. He sought to go beyond mere exploration. He wanted to dominate the new land, to stake a claim where none had before. The voyage to Vinland was a success, and soon, Thorvald and his men stood upon the familiar shores described by Leif. The land was just as his brother had said, rich, fertile, and abundant with resources. They set up camp, building shelters to withstand the coming seasons. Thorvald was convinced that Vinland could become a new home for the Norse people, a land where they could thrive without the hardships of Greenland. But unlike Leif, who had approached Vinland with respect for its untouched wilderness, Thorvald saw the land as his for the taking. He and his men explored further, cutting deeper into the forests, searching for new territories to claim. It was then that they made a fateful discovery. Vinland was not uninhabited. One day, as the Norsemen ventured inland, they came across signs of life, dwellings not of their own making, remnants of fires still warm, and tools unlike those used in Greenland or Iceland. The realization settled over them. They were not alone. The land belonged to others, a people unknown to the Norse, whose presence had been hidden beyond the forests. At first, the encounters were indirect. Shadowy figures glimpsed between the trees, quiet footsteps heard in the night. But soon, the first meeting took place. A group of native inhabitants, whom the Norse would later call Skraelings, appeared along the coastline. Unlike the Norse, who were tall and clad in iron and furs, these people were smaller, dressed in leather, and carried weapons made of stone and wood. The two groups regarded each other with caution, separated by language and culture, but bound by curiosity. Had Thorvald followed his brother's example, diplomacy might have been possible, but Thorvald was not Leif. Believing himself the rightful ruler of Vinland, he acted with aggression, seeking to assert dominance over the Skrælings. The first encounter turned violent, with Thorvald and his men driving away the natives, killing some in the process. The Norse believed they had won, but their victory was short-lived. Days later, the Skrælings returned, not as individuals, but as a force. They came in numbers, their warriors armed with bows and slings, attacking the Norse camp with speed and precision. The Norse, though experienced in battle, were unprepared for this kind of warfare. The Skrælings moved with a knowledge of the land that the Norse did not possess, striking from the shadows and vanishing before they could be caught. In the chaos of battle, Thorvald was struck by an arrow, a wound that would prove fatal. As his men retreated to their ships, carrying their wounded leader, he knew his fate was sealed. With his final breaths, he lamented his choices, perhaps realizing too late that Vinland was not his to conquer. The dream of claiming the land for the Norse had turned into a nightmare, and now it was time to leave. The remaining men, battered and grieving, abandoned their efforts and sailed back to Greenland, bringing with them the tragic news. Leif received word of his brother's death with a heavy heart. He had hoped that Vinland would be a place of prosperity, but Thorvald's actions had turned it into a battlefield. The Skrælings had made their message clear. Vinland was not a land to be taken by force. With Thorvald's failed expedition, the dream of settling Vinland grew dimmer. The Norse had learned a hard lesson. The world beyond Greenland was not empty, nor was it theirs to claim without resistance. With Thorvald's death, the dream of Vinland settled like a distant memory on the frozen shores of Greenland. The news of his brother's failure weighed heavily on Leif Erikson, not just as a man who had once seen the promise of a new land, but as a leader responsible for his people. Greenland had always been an unforgiving land, a place where survival was a constant battle against nature. It was now the only true home the Norse had. Leif understood that his father's vision of Greenland as a permanent settlement was coming to pass, but the challenges of ruling such a harsh and isolated land were greater than ever. With his father, Eric the Red, growing older and weaker, leadership fell increasingly to Leif, who had no choice but to set aside his own ambitions for exploration. He had once been a voyager, a seeker of new lands, but now he was a protector, a guide for those who depended on him. His responsibilities were numerous. He had to ensure that the settlements had enough food to survive the long winters, that trade routes remained open despite the dangerous seas, and that tensions between the Christian converts and those who still clung to the old Norse gods did not erupt into conflict. In many ways, the burden of leadership was far greater than the uncertainties of the open ocean. The sea, at least, was predictable in its dangers, but the struggles within his own people were ever-changing and complex. Despite his father's reluctance, Leif continued to support the spread of Christianity in Greenland. The small chapel his mother, Jodhild, had commissioned stood as a symbol of a new era, but not all were willing to embrace this change. Many of the older generations resisted conversion, seeing it as an abandonment of the gods who had guided their ancestors. Disputes arose between families, and Leif found himself acting as a mediator, trying to keep the settlement united even as faith divided it. But faith was not the only challenge. Greenland's environment remained unforgiving. The settlers relied on trade with Norway and Iceland for supplies that the land could not provide, grain, iron, and timber being among the most vital. Yet, the treacherous North Atlantic made such trade unpredictable. Storms could delay or sink supply ships, and when winters were particularly harsh, hunger and desperation spread quickly through the settlements. Leif took a practical approach to leadership, ensuring that resources were carefully managed and that settlements cooperated rather than competed for survival. He encouraged the people to fish more extensively, to hunt wisely, and to preserve food for the leaner months. He knew that a single mistake, a single miscalculation, could mean the difference between life and death when the ice and snow tightened their grip on the land. There were also external threats. The Inuit, a people native to the Arctic, had begun to appear along Greenland's coastline. Though the Norse and the Inuit had little interaction at first, Occasional conflicts arose when hunting grounds overlapped. Leif, unlike his brother Thorvald, understood that force was not always the answer. He sought to approach the Inuit with caution, studying their ways and learning from them rather than immediately resorting to violence. In doing so, he recognized that the Inuit had mastered survival in the Arctic far better than the Norse had. Their techniques, their understanding of the land and the sea, held valuable lessons, if only the Norse were willing to learn. Still, not all tensions could be resolved with words. Skirmishes did occur, and Leif had to make difficult decisions to protect his people. He understood that Greenland was isolated, and any prolonged conflict could weaken the settlement beyond recovery. Diplomacy and careful judgment were his greatest weapons, far more useful than the sword in maintaining the fragile peace. As the years passed, Leif grew into his role, no longer just an explorer or an adventurer, but a ruler who had to think of the generations that would follow. He had once believed his greatest legacy would be the discovery of Vinland, but now he saw that his true mark on history would be securing the survival of his people in Greenland. His dreams of returning westward faded beneath the weight of responsibility, and he accepted his role as the guardian of a land that would never be easy, but was home nonetheless. Though Vinland remained in his heart, Leif Erikson knew he could not abandon Greenland. He had seen the world beyond, but his duty was to his people, and his people needed him here. The cold winds of Greenland howled across the fjords, whispering of the distant lands he would never see again, but Leif did not waver. Years passed, and Greenland remained a place of both endurance and isolation. Leif Erikson, once the young and adventurous explorer who had discovered Vinland, had become a seasoned leader, burdened by the challenges of ruling a land that tested its people at every turn. The settlements under his guidance had survived, but survival alone was never guaranteed. The harsh climate, the fragile balance of resources, and the growing tensions within the Norse community all shaped the fate of Greenland in ways that even Leif could not always control. As the population of Greenland grew, so did the challenges of sustaining it. The once abundant, grazing lands began to show signs of strain, overused by the livestock that the settlers relied upon. The cold seasons seemed to stretch longer each year, forcing the people to adapt in ways they had never needed to before. Hunting and fishing became even more vital, but with the encroaching ice, access to open waters was often limited. Leif knew that without careful planning, the settlements could suffer a slow and inevitable decline. Despite these hardships, trade remained the lifeline of Greenland. Ships from Norway and Iceland still made the perilous journey across the North Atlantic, bringing much-needed supplies, iron tools, and other essentials that Greenland itself could not provide. But as political changes swept through Scandinavia, the once reliable trade routes grew more uncertain. Norway, now fully Christianized, had become more involved in its own affairs, and fewer ships were willing to risk the dangerous journey to Greenland for trade that was less profitable than before. Leif watched these changes with concern. He had seen firsthand how isolation could weaken a settlement. He understood that without strong ties to the outside world, Greenland's people would be left vulnerable to famine and hardship. He worked tirelessly to maintain diplomatic relations with Norwegian rulers, sending emissaries when possible and ensuring that Greenland remained valuable enough to warrant continued support. But no matter how hard he tried, he could not control the priorities of distant kings. Meanwhile, within the settlements, the divide between those who followed the old Norse gods and those who had converted to Christianity had not disappeared. Though Leif had hoped that the transition would be peaceful, there were still those who clung fiercely to the ways of Odin and Thor, refusing to accept the faith that had come from Norway. Disputes over religious practices occasionally led to conflicts between families, and Leif, ever the mediator, had to tread carefully to keep the peace. He was respected by both sides, but he knew that even respect had its limits. The Inuit, too, had become an ever-present reality in Greenland. At first, the Norse had treated them as distant curiosities, people who lived at the edges of the world. But as the years passed, interactions grew more frequent. Leif had long believed that learning from the Inuit could help the Norse adapt to Greenland's worsening conditions, but not all his people agreed. Some saw the Inuit as rivals, a competing force for scarce resources. Others believed them to be lesser people, unworthy of Norse respect. These divisions led to occasional tensions, and once again, Leif had to act as a voice of reason, urging caution and coexistence. Though he had not sailed the western seas in many years, the memory of Vinland never left him. Occasionally, he would listen to the tales of those who had attempted to follow in his footsteps, stories of new expeditions that ended in failure, of men who returned with nothing but hardship and regret. Vinland remained just out of reach, a land of promise that would never truly be claimed. Leif no longer spoke of returning, for he knew his duty was in Greenland. Still, in the quiet moments of reflection, he could not help but wonder what might have been had he chosen differently. Time had begun to leave its mark on Leif. His once golden hair had turned silver, and the strength of his youth had given way to the aches of age. Yet, despite the passage of time, he remained steadfast in his leadership. He had outlived his father, his brother, and many of his closest companions. He had seen Greenland grow, change, and struggle, and through it all, he had remained its anchor, the steady hand that guided his people through the storm. The world beyond Greenland continued to evolve, but the Norse settlements remained much as they had always been, on the edge of survival, battling the elements, holding onto their fragile existence. Leif knew that Greenland's fate would not be decided by a single leader or a single generation. It was a land that demanded resilience from all who lived upon it, and only those strong enough to endure its hardships would see another season. As the years pressed on, Leif Erikson became more than just a leader in Greenland. He became a symbol, the embodiment of the enduring spirit of his people. His name was carried on the wind, whispered by generations as they gathered around hearths, retelling the stories of his voyages, his triumphs, and his quiet leadership. Yet, despite his growing renown, Leif never sought glory for himself. His heart was grounded in the land he had called home for so long, and his legacy was not built upon conquest or discovery, but upon the survival of his people in the face of overwhelming odds. By now, the settlements in Greenland had begun to take root in a way that Leif had not imagined when he first arrived. They had grown from small, fragile colonies to thriving, though still vulnerable, communities. The land, while harsh, had provided, and through his careful stewardship, the Norse found ways to adapt. But even as the settlement stabilized, Leif knew that nothing in Greenland was permanent. Nature could change with a storm, a famine, or a harsh winter, and so too could the fortunes of men. He had learned this lesson early, having seen the collapse of many of his fellow adventurers and leaders who had been too sure of their place in the world. Leif's influence, however, was not just felt in the practicality of daily life. His actions and decisions reverberated throughout Greenland's culture and identity. Under his leadership, the island slowly transitioned into a more unified community. Though the old pagan traditions had not disappeared entirely, Christianity had spread far beyond the walls of his mother's chapel. Over the years, more Norsemen had converted, their beliefs softened not by force, but by the gradual acceptance of a new way of life. Leif did not push this change upon them, but he did nurture it, believing that his people could find a place within the new world order. And yet, Leif Erikson was not simply remembered as a Christian leader. His impact on Greenland was far more complex than a single faith or a single era. He had witnessed the brutal realities of the North Atlantic, where death could come from the sea or the land with little warning. He had seen the birth and the slow erosion of Norse power in the far west, and he had held his people together through the turbulence. As a result, many came to see Leif not only as a figurehead of faith, but as the protector of Greenland's traditions, the last true connection between the old gods of the Norse and the new beliefs brought by the Christian missionaries. But not everyone was content under Leif's rule. There were those who longed for the glory days of the Viking Age, the days of raiding and exploring, when the Norse had ruled the seas and had struck terror into the hearts of other nations. For them, Leif's peacekeeping approach felt like a betrayal, a denial of the fierce warrior spirit that had made the Norse great. Yet Leif, wise in his years, knew that the world had changed and that Greenland could not thrive by reverting to the past. The days of glory were over, and survival had become the ultimate victory. As he neared the end of his life, Leif was haunted by the thought of what might have been. Though he had left an indelible mark on Greenland, he had never returned to Vinland. His mind often wandered to the fertile shores of the land he had discovered, to the promise of a new world that could have become the homeland of his people. In his heart, he believed that Vinland was a dream still waiting to be realized, but it was a dream for another time, another generation. Leif knew that his legacy was bound to the ice and rock of Greenland, a legacy of perseverance rather than expansion. Yet even as he pondered these things in his final years, Leif's sense of duty never wavered. His role as a leader was not to fulfill his own dreams, but to ensure that his people had a future. He oversaw the building of more churches, the strengthening of the settlements, and the cultivation of trade relations with the outside world. Even in his last years, he maintained his composure, never allowing his people to see the cracks in his resolve. The harsh realities of life in Greenland were never easy, but Leif's example taught them to face adversity with patience and determination. By the time of his death, Leif Erikson had become a living legend. His name was spoken with reverence in every corner of Greenland, from the icy fjords to the windswept highlands. His voyages were chronicled in sagas, passed down from one generation to the next, inspiring both awe and admiration. Yet, the true measure of his legacy was not in the stories or the sagas, but in the endurance of his people. Greenland had not only survived, but had thrived in its own way, thanks to the quiet wisdom of one man who had understood the true cost of leadership. As Leif's funeral procession made its way across the cold, rocky shores of Greenland, it was clear that his death marked the end of an era. The settlements he had worked so hard to build would continue, though the challenges they faced were far from over. Leif had laid the groundwork, but the future of Greenland would depend on those who followed in his footsteps. The sagas would tell of his voyages, of Vinland and its promise, but it was in the day-to-day struggles of survival, in the choices made by the next generation, that his true legacy would be cemented. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, the man who had crossed the seas and brought Christianity to Greenland, had carved his place in history. He was no longer the young explorer, but a ruler whose decisions had shaped the course of an entire people. The legacy of Leif Erikson transcended the years, rippling through time like a tide that never fully recedes. Though his own life had come to an end, his influence continued to echo across the icy plains of Greenland, into the fjords and beyond the North Atlantic. In the centuries that followed his death, Leif's name became intertwined with the mythos of the Viking Age, a symbol not just of exploration, but of the endurance of the human spirit in the face of unknown challenges. Yet the true essence of his life, the one that resonated most deeply, was not found in the grand expanses of uncharted lands, but in the quiet, steadfast leadership that ensured the survival of his people. The world that Leif had known was slowly fading into the past, and with each passing generation, the lessons of his life became more distant. Greenland, though still a vital part of the Norse world, began to change. The settlements, though never as populous or influential as those in Iceland or Norway, remained strong under the foundations Leif had built. But the slow erosion of time and the harsh conditions of the land took their toll. As more of Leif's contemporaries passed away, their stories too became part of the past, and the daily struggles of survival became more pressing than the historical feats of exploration that had once captured the imagination of the people. Despite the passing of time, the tales of Vinland, the land of plenty, the land that Leif had discovered but never truly claimed, remained alive in the stories of the old men and women who had lived through those early days. The idea of Vinland became less a geographical reality and more a symbol of hope. To the people of Greenland, Vinland was the dream of what could be, a prosperous future where their descendants could thrive away from the bitter cold of their homeland. Yet, as generations passed, this dream began to feel more like an unattainable myth, something that belonged to an era when the Norse had the world at their feet. The Vinland Leif had discovered remained a tantalizing memory, but the dream of settling it was never realized. The last expeditions into the Western world, undertaken by men who followed in Leif's wake, returned with little more than disappointment. The unknown lands were either too far or too dangerous to reach, and the once promising shores of Vinland became more of a legend than a destination. Still, the idea of new lands to explore continued to capture the hearts of those who longed for a brighter future, whether in the cold fjords of Greenland or the distant horizons of the Atlantic. As the Norse world slowly transitioned away from the era of Viking raids and exploration, Leif's story took on a different meaning. No longer was he seen purely as the bold adventurer who had sailed across the vast oceans, but as the founder of a new chapter of Norse life, one of endurance, survival, and adaptation. He became, in many ways, the last great figure of a dying age. The Viking culture that had once sought conquest and glory through pillaging had given way to a more settled, more introspective way of life. And in this new world, Leif Erikson's legacy endured not as a conqueror, but as a leader who understood that the greatest victory was in ensuring the continuity of his people, no matter the odds. Over time, the stories of Leif Erikson's voyages and his leadership in Greenland became mythologized. The details of his life, once known only to those who lived alongside him, were passed down through the sagas, embellished by the voices of storytellers who added their own flourishes. As the centuries wore on, Leif became more of a heroic figure, a legend who represented the bravery of the Norse spirit. In these tales, his voyages to Vinland were described with increasing grandeur, transforming him from a real man into an almost mythical hero whose journey was emblematic of the Norse desire to push boundaries, even if the rewards were not always as grand as expected. However, even as the tales of Vinland and Leif's exploits spread through the generations, the reality of his leadership in Greenland remained a constant, though often unspoken, influence. His focus on survival, his ability to balance the old ways with the new, his patience in ensuring that his people could weather both natural and social storms. These were the true hallmarks of his leadership. In time, it was these qualities that came to define the Viking settlers of Greenland, who were often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic stories of raiding and exploring. Yet, in many ways, the very survival of the Greenlandic settlements was Leif's true legacy, a testament to the quiet strength of a leader who understood that the future depended on those who could endure and adapt. The Viking Age itself began to fade as the centuries wore on. The wars, the raids, the fierce battles for land and wealth all gave way to new political realities, and the old ways of the Norse gradually dissolved into the broader currents of European history. Yet, in Greenland, the descendants of Leif Erikson carried his legacy forward in their own way, preserving the stories of the past while adapting to the changing world around them. By the time the Viking Age had passed into history, Leif Erikson had become more than just a man of his time. He had become a symbol of the Viking spirit. The lessons of his life, not just in exploration, but in leadership, perseverance, and vision, continued to shape the identity of the Norse people long after the world he knew had disappeared. His story transcended the boundaries of geography, inspiring not just the descendants of the Vikings, but anyone who sought to push beyond the known world, to venture into the unknown, and to leave a legacy that would endure for generations. Leif Erikson's legacy was not one of grand conquests or vast empires, but of a single man who chose to live in accordance with the values he cherished: bravery, leadership, and a deep sense of duty to his people. His story, passed down through the ages, serves as a reminder that history is shaped not only by the extraordinary deeds of conquerors, but by the quiet determination of those who choose to face adversity, not with the sword, but with wisdom, patience, and an unwavering commitment to their people. And though the world Leif Erikson knew may have vanished with time, his name, and the spirit of his journey will forever echo in the hearts of those who dream of discovering new worlds, no matter how distant or difficult they may seem.